It's a gigantic scandal, and most of the world wants to say, well, yeah, probably a lab leak, but move on. I'm sorry, we can't move on. 20 million people are dead.
Matt Ridley is the co-author of Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. His book is one of the most comprehensive arguments for the lab leak theory.
Going and finding bat viruses in a cave in Yunnan or Laos and bringing them 1,000 miles north to a big city with 11 million people in it, giving them an extra feature that makes them much more infectious in human cells, and doing all that at a low biosafety level, even if that hadn't led to a pandemic. Now we know they were doing that, we should be absolutely horrified.
Today he joins me to unpack the files that Tulsi Gabbard just declassified and the coordinated campaign to bury the truth about what happened in Wuhan.
It's quite extraordinary that China has been allowed to get away with revealing almost nothing about what went on in that laboratory, and instead of saying, that's a disgrace, we can't cooperate with you scientifically until you clear this up, the world has said, oh fine, let's go on having scientific collaborations with you as much as you want.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Keller. Matt Ridley, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you, Jan, for having me on.
In her last days as Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard released a series of documents related to a cover-up around the Wuhan lab, around gain-of-function research. I know you've been following this closely. Explain to me the significance of these documents.
Well, they add confirmation to what we already knew, that there was strong intelligence pointing the intelligence agencies towards a lab leak as the cause of the pandemic almost from the very start. And then they also add what we suspected, which is that there was then a strong pushback from somebody within the administration, the US administration, to make sure those conclusions didn't get out to us, the public, and indeed were sort of reversed on political rather than scientific grounds. Now, I haven't mentioned any names in there, but the briefing, the thing that has stood out for me is the briefing of the CIA that caused it to change its mind was effectively done by Anthony Fauci, head of the National Institutes of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, who was very conflicted because he had been defending gain-of-function research. He had made sure that it got allowed again after a moratorium in America, and he had made sure that funds went to supporting that work in China, not just in the United States. So this really does show that when he told Senator Rand Paul in testimony on oath that they were not funding gain-of-function research in China, that just simply is not true.
I find this whole situation almost bizarre, right? Because very early in the pandemic, April of 2020, we created a documentary looking, I believe it was called Tracing the Origins of the Wuhan Coronavirus. It was still okay to call it the Wuhan Coronavirus at the time, which would have been a normal name for it, right?
Yeah.
And essentially the argument in the documentary was, looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. Probably a duck, right? It wasn't conclusive, but there was already enough evidence to point to a much more likely lab scenario than the other kind of wet market scenario that was brandished about. And here we are, we're still kind of arguing the same issue. Mm-hmm. There's still people that think it was a wet market at this point.
Yes, you were onto it before I was. In February and March of 2020, and even through April, I was still telling parliamentary colleagues here in the United Kingdom that it was not a lab leak, and we knew that because that possibility had been looked into by a number of American scientists who'd come to the firm conclusion that it could not possibly be a laboratory construct. They used the word ruled out. And I thought, well, that's good enough for me. These guys look like they know what they're doing. And then in May of 2020, two things happened. One was a paper came to my attention which said this virus did not evolve very fast in the first few months, and yet is very infectious. That implies that it's had prior exposure to human beings. It's not just suddenly appeared in the last few months. It's somewhere it's been in contact with human cells, and that could have been in a lab. And that paper was written by three people, one of whom was Alina Chan, who ended up being my co-author on this subject. And the other thing that happened was that George Gao, the head of the China CDC, who I've since met and interviewed, he said in May of 2020, it didn't start in the market. We've looked in the market and we can't find an infected animal. And the pattern of infection of people in the market doesn't point at an animal. Animal vendors were not infected, etc., etc. Now that's extraordinary. In the case of SARS, when the outbreak happened in 2002-03, it very quickly became apparent that there were infected animals and infected animal vendors. Now, there are 40,000 food markets of that kind in China, plus. It happened next to one that happened also to be the site of the only SARS-like beta coronavirus research program in the world. And it happened the year after they planned a very specific experiment in that lab on a virus that was 96% the same that was sitting in their own freezer in that lab, having been brought from 1,000 miles away.
So another thing I know that we both, because from reading your work, I know we both kind of zeroed in on was this proximal origins paper in Nature Medicine. When I read this, right, basically it argued that there's no chance, there's zero chance that this could be from a lab. And I thought that was an astonishing claim.
Me too.
Right?
Me too.
Yeah.
That was the paper I was referring to when I said that I started reassuring colleagues that this couldn't have come out. I was lied to. I was deceived. It is disgraceful what happened with that paper, because we now know what happened with that paper. Well, first of all, in its own terms, the paper is extremely unpersuasive. It has two main arguments for saying that it can rule out an origin. Those are the words used in a press release by Christian Andersen, the senior author, right? The first argument is it's not a perfect fit to our receptor. If we had designed it, we'd have made it perfect. What? It's a pretty good fit. Where did you get the idea that we would always get it right first time or whatever? You know, that was a completely bizarre argument. And the other argument was, yes, it's got a furin cleavage site, which makes it way more infectious than any other sarbecovirus. And no other sarbecovirus has ever been found with one. But don't worry, we'll find one with one in it naturally. Well, 6 years on, we still haven't found one. So that was a non-argument at the time and is an even weaker argument now. So on its own terms, the paper was extremely unpersuasive. And we know it was unpersuasive because the senior author of that paper, in his private messages, said before, during, and after publishing the paper, in his private messages, I still think a lab leak is frigging likely. That was the words he used. What? I'm sorry, but when I was in science, like you, I'm an evolutionary biologist by background, you do not publish papers that say the opposite of what you think. And so he claims he's changed his mind. He didn't change his mind. He changed his line. Now, why did he change his line? Well, we know a little bit about that too, because he had an exchange with one of his co-authors. This is a man named Christian Andersen, and the co-author was Andrew Rambo. They had an exchange in which Rambo said, I hate it when it gets political, but sometimes you have to make compromises politically. I can't remember the exact wording, but it was like that. Anderson replied, yep, I completely agree. It's a pity you have to get political, but we have to. For political reasons, they published a paper that says the very opposite of what they thought in private. The other thing that's wrong with that paper is that they got in, it was basically commissioned by Jeremy Farrar of the Wellcome Trust and Anthony Foucher of NIAID, who were consulted throughout, who helped change the wording and are not mentioned in the paper. And we have now got emails saying, please don't mention us in the paper. Again, that is a scientific disgrace. Yet, as you say, hundreds of us have written to the editor of Nature Medicine saying, this paper must be retracted. It's wrong, it doesn't say what they thought, it's left out some authors, it's disguised its origins, and it's misled the world.
Matt, we have a quick break coming. Folks, we're going to be right back. And we're back with Matt Ridley, co-author of Viral. The intelligence community clearly knew that this lab was a Chinese military lab. This is now, why am I saying that? Because in China, there's a military-civil fusion doctrine. If something has a military potential, heads will roll if that military potential isn't explored in a technology. And here, we're talking about gain-of-function research and viruses. Like this is bioweapons research on the other side of the coin, so to speak. So absolutely it's a military lab. Absolutely the intelligence community had to know that. I'm looking at these emails, chummy conversations between the head of the Chinese CDC, right, and the Americans. I find that bizarre because we're dealing with the Chinese Communist Party here, right?
Yep. To be fair, I think it's best described as a dual-purpose lab. There was,
obviously,
there was a military side to it, and there was a civilian side.
Yes.
Quite where the boundary was between them, we don't know.
It's just that the military side is of importance
of
here.
Enormous importance.
Right.
And I don't myself think we have evidence that they were trying to make a weapon out of SARS-CoV viruses. I think it's more likely that they thought of themselves in military terms as doing something defensive. Mm-hmm. How do we get ready to react if someone uses a SARS-CoV virus as a weapon against us? Mm-hmm. But that's nearly always the excuse for bioweapons research, by the way, in the West and the East.
Right.
And of course, it's a sort of self-fulfilling motion. The basic facts are that Ralph Barrick in North Carolina invented a technique for manipulating coronaviruses. And it was a brilliant technique, and it meant that you could swap spike genes between coronaviruses. And the Chinese said, could we copy that technology? And basically, Americans said, yes, as long as you let us have access to some of your viruses. Some kind of deal like that was done. And they then got quite good at that technique. And they produced, in that lab, this is not speculation, this is fact. They produced viruses that killed mice 3 times as efficiently, and that increased the viral load in humanized mice 10,000 times. Now, if one of those viruses, which, by the way, is being tested on a humanized mice with human ACE2 receptors, if one of those viruses got out, of course it would cause a pandemic. Now, the experiments we've seen did not happen to a virus close enough to SARS-CoV-2 to do that, but we know that in the last year they switched to looking at ones that were closer. They were doing this at biosafety level 2. I mean, that's a gloves and a mask. You don't even have to wear a mask in a biosafety level 2 lab. You're not suited up. There's no negative pressure and all that kind of thing. And the reason, the EcoHealth Alliance, their American collaborator who was funneling US taxpayers' money to the lab, said, yeah, we like doing this work in Wuhan because it's more cost effective because they work at a lower biosafety level. Get your head around that. It's a gigantic scandal, and most of the world wants to say, well, yeah, probably a lab leak, but move on. I'm sorry, we can't move on. 20 million people are dead. A technology has just demonstrated to every terrorist on the planet that this is a really good way of bringing the world economy to its knees. And all you need to do is set up a biological laboratory and start working on viruses and hire a few experts. And do you know what? There's no treaty, there's no international monitoring, nobody is saying who's ordering the reagents, who's working on particular kinds of viruses. This is not an academic exercise where we want to know why people died. This is something where we need to make sure it doesn't happen again. And by the way, I spoke to a very senior scientist in the UK at one point who had been predicting that we'd have a nasty biological accident at some point around now. And I said, well done, you got that right. And he said, no. It's very important we never find out. It's very important we never find out.
Explain that to me.
I said, why? And he said, because it would disrupt relations with China? He said, you're probably right, it probably did come out of a lab, but it's better we don't find out. I said, would you say that about a plane crash? You know, when a plane crashes, we now have a system in the world where the details of why that crash happened are shared. You can't, you know, if British Airways crashes, it doesn't say, no, United Airlines can't be privy to the information we found out. We have a global agreement that says that every plane crash, the lessons from it are shared with everybody. Why don't we have that in this case?
Why don't you tell me why you think this senior scientist has this view, this astonishing view?
There is a huge dependence of Western science on China now, collaboration with China, Chinese funding. Many of the science journals get most of their revenue from Chinese researchers, not most, but a very, very large chunk of their revenue from Chinese scientists. China actually has an arrangement where it pays up front for publication fees in journals. It rewards scientists for publishing in high-impact journals financially, and so many of them slice and dice their results to get as many publications out as possible. So Chinese scientists in that sense are very productive, and that makes them very lucrative for Western scientific publishing. That's an issue that needs looking into. But there is also a general admiration of the Chinese regime in academia. We've seen this explicitly in all sorts of ways, but academics are very left-wing in this country and most of the Western world. Academics are, in my experience, and have been for quite a long time, people who admire top-down directive politics. They don't think in terms of bottom-up democracy. They think it's messy. They think, look, come on, whoever's in charge should say this needs to be done. You know, tell people to brush their teeth twice a day. Tell people not to drink milk. Or you know, the desire to tell the world how to behave is quite strong in academia. So when the pandemic came along, you had people from the academic world, the editor of The Lancet is one of them. He published editorial praising Xi Jinping thought at one point, who said, now look at China. They're cracking down on this virus. They're telling people not to leave their homes. That's what we need. You know, the whole sort of authoritarianism was very appealing to a certain kind of academic, public health official, government bureaucrat in the West. So there is a China worship problem here that doesn't see the harsh side of that kind of regime and doesn't think in terms of liberty and personal liberty. And they didn't want blame for this virus to go to this regime they rather admire. This virus was too infectious and too infectious in asymptomatic people for lockdowns to work. Full stop. That's what we need to learn. They might have worked in the early months in Wuhan when it wasn't quite so infectious and when you had a ridiculously authoritarian regime, but no, next time we have a highly infectious viral pandemic, we must not reach for locking down the population. And that, by the way, was the conclusion of the public health establishment before the pandemic. Months before the pandemic came out, they had a big publication on this saying, whatever we do, we must resist the temptation from politicians to lock down the entire population. It won't work. If the virus is sufficiently infective, it won't work. It's fine with one that's not very infectious, you know, and you can lock down a limited number of people. Except
there's this small issue of civil liberties and free societies we may want to consider, right?
Good Lord, where did you get that idea? But I personally think, as an evolutionary biologist, that there is a point that gets missed here. And that is that viruses jump out of animals and into people quite often. We've had AIDS in our lifetime, we've had Ebola happening just quite recently, and others. So the theory that you can catch a new virus from an animal is not wrong. Of course you can. But they very, very rarely prove to be highly infectious from the start. They have to stutter their way through human-to-human chains of infection for quite a long time before they get really good at spreading, and then they can take off. They also tend to be pretty lethal. So Ebola kills, 30%. Hantavirus kills 30% of the people it infects. So you're much more likely to see what you're seeing with Ebola, horrible outbreaks, but you can bring them under control. Or Hanta, on that cruise ship, a few people die and a few more people have to be in quarantine for a while, and then it's over. What we saw this time was completely different. A virus that was not very lethal. I mean, all-age mortality from this virus was something like less than 0.5%. That's sort of equivalent to flu, roughly. So it was not very lethal, but very infectious. That, to me, tells you this wasn't a normal zoonosis. That, to me, tells you that it must have had training on human cells and human molecules in the months, if not years, leading up to the pandemic. Given that we know this lab was taking SARS-like beta coronaviruses, this very type of virus, and infecting them into human cells and humanized mice for several years before the pandemic, it's crazy to think that this wasn't how this happened. And therefore, we really need to rethink our approach to pandemics. The idea that surveillance of outbreaks so that we know when they're happening and can react quickly is great. But going and finding bat viruses in a cave in Yunnan or Laos and bringing them 1,000 miles north to a big city with 11 million people in it, to the middle of a big city, putting them in a lab, sequencing them, doing manipulation experiments on them, giving them an extra feature that makes them much more infectious in human cells, and doing all that at a low biosafety level, even if that hadn't led to a pandemic. Now we know they were doing that, we should be absolutely horrified. It does nothing to ready us for a pandemic. The purpose of that experiment, as far as we can make out, those series of experiments, was so that they could say one day, look, aren't we clever? We've made a vaccine that works against any kind of coronavirus. Well, they were nowhere near that. And they were looking for a gas leak with a lighted match.
Well, Matt Ridley, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for joining Matt Ridley and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Yanya Kellek.